You can feel it in the way she talks to you, the way she reacts, the way she no longer looks at you like she once did. Something shifted, and you're not imagining it. Modern men are being softened, slowed, and stripped of their natural edge. Not with force, but with subtle expectations that punish strength and reward passivity. And while men crumble under that pressure, many women quietly gain from it. More control in the relationship, more emotional bargaining power, more freedom to act without consequence. A man who doubts himself is a man she can steer. A man who over-apologizes is a man she can override. And a man who forgets his own authority becomes a man she doesn't have to respect. The question is, how did this happen, and how do you break the pattern? That's what we're diving into next. You know what's happening out there, even if no one has ever said it to your face. Men aren't becoming weaker because they suddenly stop trying. They're becoming weaker because everything around them is engineered to dilute what makes them men in the first place. And the worst part? Most men don't even notice the shift until they wake up one day feeling like strangers inside their own lives. For generations, a man's identity was tied to three pillars: leading, providing, and protecting. Not because society forced it on him, but because those roles aligned with how he's wired. Yet today, each of those pillars is quietly being chipped away, not with open confrontation, but with a slow drip of cultural messaging telling him he's too much, too aggressive, or too controlling, simply for being who he is. That's how emasculation works. It doesn't hit you like a punch. It drains you like a leak in the foundation until the whole structure feels unstable. And this shift isn't accidental. As masculinity gets reframed as a flaw, the world pushes men toward a safer, softer, more malleable version of themselves. A version that doesn't challenge anything. A version that doesn't lead. A version that won't say no. A version that can be easily replaced or easily controlled. You see it everywhere, in families where men sit in silence because they're afraid of causing conflict. In communities where male influence is dismissed as outdated. In media that mocks traditional masculine traits unless they're being used for entertainment. The more men step back, the more room women gain to step forward, and not always in ways that create balance. Many women quickly recognize when a man is shrinking, and they adapt fast. When a man's presence weakens, her influence expands, emotionally, domestically, financially. Imagine a man coming home every day, feeling like nothing he does matters. His advice is brushed off. His effort is invisible. His presence is optional. That's the moment the spiral begins. He questions himself. He apologizes for existing, and he becomes so unsure of his own value that he starts letting others define it for him. And here's the truth. Most people won't say out loud. A weakened man is easier to control than a strong one, and many women know that. When a man loses his position in his own life, something else happens quietly in the background. Women start to recalibrate. Not because they're evil, not because they're plotting, but because human psychology always moves toward whatever gives the most safety with the least responsibility. And a weakened man changes the entire power dynamic inside a relationship. Modern women crave freedom, emotional freedom, financial freedom, lifestyle freedom. But freedom always comes with a cost: accountability. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid saying out loud. When a man loses his leverage, that accountability disappears for her. She can make decisions without resistance. She can shape the relationship without negotiation. She doesn't have to adapt, soften, or compromise. Why would she, when nothing is pushing back? When a man has no influence, she has no reason to respect him. That's the psychological shift. That's where everything turns. A woman doesn't have to raise her voice or manipulate directly. The dynamic adjusts on its own. She becomes the emotional center. She becomes the decision maker. She becomes the one who sets the rules, Because the man standing beside her has stopped setting any for himself. And this isn't new. Throughout history, women depended on strong men because survival demanded it. But once systems stepped in to replace that strength, income, protection, stability, dependence was no longer necessary. So what happens next? Women start optimizing, not maliciously, strategically. They choose what benefits them emotionally and materially, and a man without authority becomes a man they can navigate around instead of a man they must stand beside. Picture this. A man constantly checking her mood, adjusting his tone, apologizing for things he didn't do, trying to keep the peace. He thinks he's being loving, but she sees something else. A man who's losing himself to earn approval. And the moment she senses that shift, something inside her detaches. Respect fades, attraction dulls, and control becomes effortless. She doesn't have to dominate him. He's already dominating himself. That's why so many women today function comfortably with men who are hesitant, uncertain, overly accommodating. It gives them emotional mobility. They can act without consequence. They can withdraw affection to steer his behavior. They can leverage conflict to center attention on their needs. Because here's the hidden mechanism. A man with no leverage becomes a man she doesn't have to respect. And once respect is gone, the entire relationship tilts heavily in her favor. This is why women, consciously or not, often benefit when a man weakens, not because they're cruel, but because the power vacuum gives them room to expand. Before you can understand why so many men feel powerless today, you have to look back at the moment when the shift truly began. The moment a system, not a partner, became the primary provider. This wasn't just a political decision. It was a psychological earthquake that rewired the entire structure of male-female dynamics. When welfare programs expanded in the mid-20th century, they created an unintended ripple effect. These systems weren't built to weaken men outright, but they absolutely did. Suddenly, a woman could receive the financial stability she once relied on a man for, without the man. And the message was subtle but unmistakable. If you want guaranteed support, remove him from the picture. Those man-in-the-house laws took that message to the extreme. A man's presence could disqualify a household from receiving assistance. Think about the emotional violence of that. A father standing in his own doorway was no longer seen as a source of security, but as an obstacle to survival. Families weren't breaking because men failed. They were breaking because the system rewarded their absence. And here's where the psychology comes in. Once a woman learns she can gain stability without a man, her subconscious recalibrates what a man is worth. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but inevitably. She no longer needs to choose a man for strength. She doesn't have to value leadership or discipline. She doesn't even have to commit to a man she respects. Because the system has rewritten the rules. The system has become the provider. And the man, once central, becomes optional. Women of that era didn't suddenly lose their desire for partnership. But they did gain something new. Leverage. They could select security without selecting a strong man. They could avoid responsibility for choosing poorly because the state would catch them if they fell. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, male value shifted from essential to negotiable. In that kind of environment, what happens to men? They start questioning their own relevance. When the world tells a man he's no longer needed, he begins to believe it. And women, consciously or not, internalize the same narrative. That the system is the dependable one, not him. And here is the truth you must not ignore. When a system replaces the man, the woman stops valuing the man. Not because she's heartless, but because psychology follows incentives, every time, without exception. Nowhere is emasculation more silently brutal than in the world of child support and custody. This is where a man learns, often for the first time, that the system doesn't just question his value. It assigns him a number, and that number shows up on a payment slip every month. 85% of child support flows from fathers to mothers, and on paper, it sounds noble. Supporting the child. But emotionally, it creates a fracture most people never talk about. Because what happens when a man is stripped of the ability to be a father in practice, yet is required to fund a household he no longer belongs to? He becomes a financial participant in a life he's no longer allowed to experience. He watches from a distance while decisions are made without him, milestones happen without him, and his presence is reduced to a legal footnote. And all the while, the system reminds him, your value is your wallet, not your role. This is where identity erosion begins. Not because men are unwilling to support their children, but because the court often treats a man's emotional connection as irrelevant and a woman's emotional position as unquestionable. He loses access, loses influence, and loses the daily bonds that once defined him, yet his obligations remain fixed, enforced, and punishable if unmet. And for many women, the power dynamic shifts effortlessly. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of structure. When she receives guaranteed financial support, she doesn't have to maintain emotional cooperation. She doesn't have to negotiate parenting decisions. She doesn't have to consider the man's needs, schedule, or voice. She holds the majority of the custody. She holds the legal advantage. She holds the leverage, even if she never asked for it directly. And this is where unconscious benefit emerges. A system designed to protect families ends up incentivizing the removal of men from them. It creates a subtle psychological message for women. You can function without him, and you'll be supported regardless. Meanwhile, the man feels something deeper than financial strain. He feels erased from his child's life, erased from the role that once made him proud, erased from the identity he thought was untouchable. Because here's the truth you can't ignore. When a man becomes optional emotionally but mandatory financially, he loses more than money. He loses identity. If you really want to understand why so many men feel displaced today, you have to look at the environments where they once thrived, the workplace and the home. These were the two arenas where a man's competence, discipline, and drive translated directly into respect. But as both spaces shifted, the ground under his feet shifted with them. Workplaces began to reward softness over strength, diplomacy over decisiveness, emotional sensitivity over clear direction. None of these traits are bad, but they're not the traits that traditionally define how men operate. So, what happens when a man walks into a space designed to suppress the instincts that once made him effective? He holds back. He second-guesses. He edits himself before he speaks. And a man who hesitates stops feeling like a man. The pressure to not offend, not dominate, not assert too strongly, slowly conditions him into a version of himself that blends in instead of stands out. And the more he blends in, the more invisible he becomes, both at work and at home. Because masculine confidence isn't something a man turns off at the office and turns back on at the front door. Once it weakens everywhere, and women feel that shift immediately. When a woman senses that her partner is shrinking outside, she subconsciously steps forward inside. Not because she wants to control him, but because someone has to fill the vacuum. Influence is never left empty. The moment a man hesitates, the woman beside him recalibrates her role. She starts making decisions. She handles logistics. She initiates structure. She grows into the position he stopped occupying. Before long, the dynamic flips. He's no longer the anchor. He's the accessory. He's no longer the direction. He's the passenger. He becomes a man living in a home that runs without his leadership. Imagine a man sitting at his own dinner table, feeling like a guest instead of the foundation. Not because his partner is domineering, but because his authority evaporated the moment he stopped exercising it, in every part of his life. And here's the truth most people won't admit. A man who loses influence outside the home often loses authority inside the home too. Not through force, not through conflict, but through slow, silent erosion. The kind that reshapes a relationship without a single argument. There's a moment in a man's life that he rarely talks about. The moment he realizes he's no longer leading himself. Not because someone took his power, but because somewhere along the way, he handed it over. Quietly. Gradually. Piece by piece. That's what emasculation really is. It's not a single blow. It's a psychological unraveling. It starts with losing a role. Then losing confidence. Then losing the ability to say what he truly thinks. A man who once walked with clarity now moves with caution. He becomes hyper-aware of people's reactions, especially the woman he's with. He starts gauging her expressions before he makes decisions. He over-explains. He over-apologizes. He over-corrects. Not to be kind, but to avoid friction. What he doesn't realize is that every time he trades authenticity for approval, he teaches her something. My boundaries are negotiable. My needs can wait. My voice doesn't matter. And once she learns that, the dynamic shifts dramatically. Some women, especially those who naturally lean toward control, sense the gap immediately. Not as an opportunity to support him, but as an opportunity to steer him. When a man loses his internal compass, a woman's emotional leverage becomes incredibly powerful. She can withdraw affection, and he panics. She can show disappointment, and he scrambles. She can express frustration, and he changes himself overnight. Not because she's manipulating, but because he's moldable. And psychologically, a moldable man is the easiest man to influence. He wants so badly to be accepted that he becomes addicted to harmony. He thinks compliance will rebuild respect. He thinks softness will restore connection. He thinks minimizing himself will prove his value. But here's the truth he doesn't see. Every attempt to earn her approval only convinces her that he has less of it to begin with. Because women don't follow men who chase them. Women don't admire men who abandon their own standards. Women don't feel anchored by men who need permission to exist. And this is where the emotional exploitation happens, often unintentionally. She realizes she can guide his decisions simply by shifting her tone. She realizes arguments can be won with silence. She realizes loyalty, boundaries, and structure now rest entirely on her terms. And a relationship built on her terms alone becomes a relationship where he slowly disappears. By the time he notices, he's already living in a version of himself he doesn't recognize, passive, anxious, disconnected from his own instincts. And that's why the warning is so sharp. When a man stops leading himself, every woman around him starts leading him, whether she admits it or not, because nature hates a vacuum. And when a man gives up his power, someone always picks it up. There's a new marketplace in the modern world, and it's not built on products. It's built on attention. And men who have been emotionally weakened, stripped of direction, or drained of confidence are the easiest targets inside it. Because once a man loses the sense that he matters in his real life, he starts searching for validation anywhere he can feel seen. And the internet is full of women who know exactly how to offer that feeling, for a price. This isn't about morality, it's about psychology. A man who once derived value from his leadership, his purpose, and his presence now tries to recreate that feeling through digital breadcrumbs. A smile, a message, a bit of attention that feels like connection, but isn't connection at all. Women who understand this dynamic, whether consciously or instinctively, turn it into opportunity. And they monetize the one thing weakened men crave most: acknowledgement. A man who has lost his emotional footing becomes predictable. He will pay to feel noticed. He will pay to feel chosen. He will pay to feel relevant again. Not because he's irresponsible, but because he's starving. Meanwhile, the woman on the screen doesn't have to offer commitment, respect, or partnership. She doesn't even have to know his name. She only has to provide the illusion of intimacy, long enough for him to keep coming back. Picture him sitting alone at night, scrolling, convincing himself this interaction is harmless. But deep down, it fills the void created when he stopped feeling significant in his own world. Every dollar he sends, every subscription he renews, every moment he spends consuming her content reveals the same truth. He's trying to buy back a sense of worth that he lost somewhere else. And for her? It's simple economics. The weaker he is, the stronger her income becomes. The lonelier he feels, the more valuable his attention is. The less empowered he is, the more she gains by offering a curated version of desire that he can't access in real life. This dynamic doesn't make her malicious. It makes the system powerful. It rewards her for tapping into male vulnerability. It encourages her to lean into the fantasy because the fantasy pays more than reality ever could. And here's the line most men don't want to face. If a woman can profit from a man's loneliness, she never needs his strength. That's the final stage of emasculation, when a man's need for connection becomes a revenue stream, and his longing becomes the very thing someone else benefits from. By now, you can see the pattern clearly. None of these shifts happened overnight, and none of them happened by accident. Piece by piece, system by system, expectation by expectation, men were pushed further from the center of their own lives. And as that happened, women, consciously or not, stepped into the space that opened. Some benefited emotionally, some benefited financially, some simply adapted to the way the world rewarded their position. But here's what you cannot forget. A weakened man is not a natural state. It's a conditioned one. The culture may try to soften you. The system may try to sideline you. The people around you may get used to a version of you that barely resembles who you are. But none of that has the final say unless you let it. Because the core truth stands, untouched by politics, trends, or opinions. A woman cannot emasculate a man who refuses to hand over his power. Your strength is not stolen. It is surrendered. And if you surrendered it, you can reclaim it. Reclaiming your boundaries is power. Reclaiming your voice is power. Reclaiming your standards, your discipline, your direction. That is how you rebuild the man you were meant to be. You don't need the world to shift before you stand up straighter. You don't need approval before you speak with conviction. You don't need permission to take your place in your own life again. You can't rewrite the entire system today, but you can rewrite yourself. And sometimes that's enough to change everything around you. If this message hit something real in you, then stay with me. Subscribe so you don't walk this journey alone. Like and share this video if it gave you clarity you didn't have before. And comment below. Tell me where in your life you're ready to take your power back. Because this is your turning point. And you're not going back to the man you used to be.